Good evening, everybody. We're going to go to 2 Kings 4 tonight. And we have, I think, just barely introduced this section after we focused on the book of Obadiah in our last class. And tonight, what we're going to look at, for the most part, is a description of the work and labor of Elisha. Now, we will talk more about him along the way, but this is the section where we get most of the description of his work. And I think really what we do is we parallel it in a lot of ways to the work of Elijah. We see a lot of similar things being done by the two of them. And then depending on time, we'll make our way and see some other significant things he does. We'll be in 2 Kings for tonight, and we'll pick back up with the Judah kings later on. Anything you want to say by way of introduction? All right. We're ready to start, I think, in verse 8. Isn't that right? All right. So remember that we have just talked about the wife of one of the prophets the prophet had passed away, and now the wife is remaining there. She's got young sons, and Elisha helps make preparation for them. Let's go down to verse 8, and we'll pick up and read down through verse 17 if you'll follow along. One day Elisha went on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. And she said to her husband, "Behold, now I know that this is a holy man of God who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls, and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there." One day he came there, and he turned into the chamber and rested there. And he said to Gehazi his servant, "Call this Shunammite." When he had called her, she stood before him. And she said, "Say now to her, see you have," and he said to him, "Say now to her, see you have taken all this trouble for us. What is to be done for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army?" She answered, "I dwell among my own people." And he said, "What then is to be done for her?" Gehazi answered, "Well, she has no son, and her husband is old." He said, "Call her." And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway. And he said, "At this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son." And she said, "No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant." But the woman conceived, and she bore a son about that time, the following spring, as Elisha said to her. All right. So the first thing we notice, I think, is just the hospitality and the care of this woman. And I don't know all the ways in which it would have been necessarily apparent to her that Elisha was a man of God, except his daily meeting of his responsibilities or whenever he passed through there. Maybe the things they talked about, maybe the things they discussed. But you really don't have much indication that he's doing anything miraculous or powerful right there in front of her. But she is convinced that he is indeed a man of God, and so she makes preparation for him. I like the simplicity, but the sufficiency of the room that she prepares. A bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. If you're traveling through, that's about what you need, at least in the ancient world. I would use a few dozen other things that would need to be on the list, but a refrigerator and bathroom, installation and all that. But they don't have all that stuff. But, when I think about myself as a Bible student, man, that's about what I'd want, is a bed, a chair, a table, and a lamp, and I would be okay for a while. So she prepares that. He sees the kindness, the thoughtfulness in this, and I love the way he says this. All this trouble you've been done for us, what can we do for you? Do you want us to say something to the king or to the army? And I expect, in the ancient world, you were kind of at the whim of the king and of the army, and they could take your stuff. They could, borrow it and never bring it back. They could steal it or, just kind of use it for their own purposes. And I like the way she responded. "I dwell among my own people." Almost as, I've got everything I need right here. I've got the protection I need. I'm safe. I don't. And so notice this. When you think about this woman, she's content, is what you see in this, to the extent that she's ready to give. So she's giving to Elisha,
And then you say, well, what's at work there? Is she trying to get something out of him? No, she just got enough to be able to give and to share. And I like that idea. And so Gehazi, the servant, who we will see as later not as reliable as we would like for him to be, but in this moment, Elisha says, what can we do? Well, she doesn't have a son, and her husband's old. And so seeing that and making preparation for that, he says she's going to have a son. Now, notice this. At the end of verse 16, she may think it's incredible, right? I think basically what she's saying is, don't get my hopes up for that. Don't say that this is what's going to happen and it not happen. But then the Bible, the way it reports it, is just so matter of fact, straight to the point. The woman conceived, bore a son about that time the following spring. It's not as if it's like, wow, can you believe it? You know, she couldn't believe it. It was astounding to everyone around. It's just, she doubted that it would come true, that this would be the case, that he was getting her hopes up, and then very matter-of-factly reporting, this is what happened. I think we see that a lot with Jesus when we see his miracles being described. We see kind of the build up to it. I think the one I think about the most in this way is Jairus' daughter, the 12-year-old little girl, and the crowd is following him. The weepers are there. Jairus is there. The person comes, don't even bother the teacher anymore. She's already died. He says, little girl, get up. And just imagine the reaction of Jairus and Miss Jairus. And Jesus says, remember to give her something to eat. So the Bible does that. It'll create these circumstances where our minds should just be blown by it. But Elisha's not surprised by this. The scriptures aren't surprised by this. Jesus wasn't surprised by his power. I would be, if I went in and said, little girl to get up, and I'd say, did you see that? Did you see what just happened? But not Jesus, and not Elisha, because he knows where his power is coming from. Anything through verse 17 you'd like to share? Anybody else have a question or a comment?
You mentioned her contentment. And
yeah.
That's something we need to learn in our own lives.
Yeah, sure. That's right. Even in a situation where you might would have considered her to have been rightfully discontent, right, not having a son, and yet she is content, and so learned how to give of her means, even when it wasn't to a next generation. It was to Elisha. She was able to help and support him.
And I think you can tell by her doubting, don't get my hopes up, that's something that she really would have wanted.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and I don't know exactly what the ancient world was like, but so many of the prophets coming through. Just imagine how many times she had heard or gotten false hope just through natural means, false hope of an anticipation of that, and maybe even a prophet saying, "Yeah, it's going to happen for you," and then we see that with the false prophets a lot, making promises to people that don't come true, and then here he comes and he starts talking in these terms, and I'm sure people have been talking in those terms for a long, long time to her. And he comes and makes that promise. And don't get my hopes up, but then very matter-of-factly, that's exactly what happened. When I read this, I also think of Luke 1 with the angel telling Zechariah that he's going to have a son. And basically, he's a little bit stronger in his doubt. Like, how can this be? Like this. What do you mean that's going to happen? Couldn't believe it. So that he's made mute and deaf. But then what happens? Very matter-of-factly, she conceives, bears a son, and Elizabeth gives birth to John the Baptist. So you see that I think that's really what Luke is doing in Luke 1, is when you hear about Zechariah and Elizabeth, old of age and unable to bear children, and then you hear about the way the miracle is reported, and you hear about the language that's used surrounding them. I think we're supposed to be getting all of the links in our mind to those Old Testament narratives. Where God left off 400 years ago, he's picking right back up and going to act in an even more incredible way, and he does. Okay. Anything else through verse 17? All right. You want to take us further?
Okay, so she has this child. When the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers, and he said to his father, "Oh, my head, my head." The father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." And when he had lifted him up and brought him into his mother, the child sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. Then she called to her husband and said, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again." And he said, "Why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath." She said, "All is well." And she saddled the donkey, and she said to her servant, "Urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you." So she went out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child?" And she answered, "All is well." And when she came to the mountain of the man of God, she caught hold of his feet. And Gehazi came to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." Then she said, Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, "Do not deceive me"? He said to Gehazi, "Tie up your garment and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. And if anyone greets you, do not reply, and lay my staff on the face of the child." Then the mother of the child said, As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So he arose and followed her. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or sign of life. Therefore he returned to meet him and told him, "The child has not awakened." When Elisha came into the house, he saw the child was lying dead on his bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Then he went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself upon him. The flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again and walked once back and forth in the house, and went up and stretched himself upon him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunammite." So he called her, and when she came to him, he said, "Pick up your son." She came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. The loss of a child, it would just be a horrible thing. I don't know if anyone in here has had this happen, but I don't know how anybody can deal with it. But what about the loss of a child spiritually? You know, it should be worse, but the only reason that it may not be worse is there is a chance that there's a chance of that child returning. And this is a time when faith and hope has to be the strongest, I'm sure. You have to put your best efforts into regaining a lost child. And Alan offered an invitation the other night and mentioned about texting and being there in person. And here, Elisha sends his staff on ahead, and I compared that to a text. It didn't work, and Elisha shows up in person, and I don't know that that's a good comparison or not, but he had to be there in person, and it makes a difference. It makes a difference when you're trying to help someone rather than just offering.
It is interesting. This is a much more kind of intense description of the miracle that occurs versus the previous one. And so her first attitude in this section, so I would say contentment in the first one, and then I would say confidence in the second one, because husband asks, all is well. Gehazi asks, all is well. I do think that there's a little bit of maybe an emotional break when she actually receives Elisha and has to explain what's happened. But I think a lot of times we can express confidence until I've got to tell you what happened. And then when I'm trying to communicate what actually happened or what the situation is, then the emotions kind of break through and it's a little more difficult to be, confident in that moment. But she kind of says, look, I told you not to play a game, not to give me a son. And then here he is and he's been taken away. And Elisha recognizes that this is not what he wanted to happen. And I wonder, it's interesting when he says that the Lord withheld it from him and didn't tell him. And I wonder if could it be a test of faith for the Shunammite woman? Could it be just an example for us to see the pursuit of the man of God here? It kind of reminds me, again, I know these stories, they sound familiar in the life of Jesus because I think what Jesus does when he comes is he magnifies the story. But it reminds me, in this case, of the woman who came, the Syrophoenician woman, whose daughter was demon-possessed, and she came and asked, and he said, it's not appropriate to give the bread to the children. She said, I just need a crumb. And that almost reminds me of this woman. Perfect contentedness, confidence in the man of God that's coming, and then there will be healing that's provided. Now, the way that Elisha heals him maybe is one of the strangest ways in which somebody is healed or raised in the Old Testament, and yet it's effective, and Elisha is able to give him back to his mother.
Why do you suppose she said all is well? That's a thought I had.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm asking.
Yeah, I would say I would say that it probably, in my mind, was a reflection to her that it's all going to work out okay, one way or the other. You know what I mean? That I mean, maybe she doesn't know that Elisha is going to raise him from the dead, but that's kind of how I read it. But that's because I already knew the ending. I'm not sure she did know the ending.
Is it all as well spiritually?
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know.
That either way, it was all well. Whether he, yeah. That's kind of what I was thinking. But then when she actually arrives there, she kind of wonders why he let this happen. But there is a sense in which
she was distressed.
She was
distressed,
that's right. But confident, I think, in Elisha's ability to do something about it. So, anyway,
she didn't waste any time.
No, don't slow down.
Yeah,
unless I tell you. Anything else through verse 37, Mr. Timmy? Any comments or questions? Austin, you look like you're pondering. Okay, good. Well, just keep pondering until you got something, and then you can help us. All right. Okay, let's finish up here in chapter 4, this last little section in verse 38. And Elisha came again to Gilgal when there was a famine in the land, and as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, set on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. One of them went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds and came and cut them up into the pot of stew, not knowing what they were. And they poured out some for the men to eat. But while they were eating of the stew, they cried out, O man of God, there is death in the pot. And they could not eat it. He said, then bring the flour. And he threw it into the pot and said, pour out some for the men that they may eat. And there was no harm in the pot. A man of God came from Baal Shalisha, bringing the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh ears of grain in a sack. And Elisha said, give the men that they may eat. But a servant said, how can I set this before 100 men? So he repeated, give them to the men that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. And he set it before them, and they ate and had some left according to the word of the Lord. All right, so here Elisha comes. Now, I want you to notice this idea of the sons of the prophets. We'll notice them again, especially when we get to like the end of 6. There's another reference to the sons of the prophets. I take it to be that these are like prophetic trainees or disciples or students, and that probably Elijah in the first place and then Elisha are their main teachers. And so when he comes, he's trying to provide for them. It says there's about 100 of them, I think, down in verse, what is that? 43. Yes, that's right. But first, he's going to make stew. Somebody gets wild gourds. Evidently, these were poisonous wild gourds, throws them in the pot. He doesn't know what he's doing. There's death in the pot. I remember my dad preaching a sermon called There's Death in the Pot. And I don't know that it was the most direct application of what this passage is supposed to be teaching us, but it was an interesting sermon. And he was talking about false teaching and people they throw bad ideas in, and we eat of that, and there's death in the pot. Well, that's certainly true. Good thing there was a man who knew the truth there to set things out. And in this case, good thing there was Elisha here to set things right. And he says, so he's going to pour in this flour, and it's going to be fixed so they can eat it. And then here's another opportunity. They're going to eat this bread, these ears of grain in his sack. Well, there's not enough to feed all these people. What does that remind you of? Jesus feeding the 4,000 men and then the 5,000. And again, I think, well, there's just 100 here. This is an impressive miracle. It'll pale in comparison to what Jesus is coming to do. I think it's helpful to think of all of these Old Testament characters in a good way or a bad way being a preview of the one who is coming. So Elisha is in a good way a preview of what's coming, but it's just a foretaste. It's just a preview. It's just a shadow. It's not the fullness. You know, somebody would say Elisha is an impressive man of God. Just you wait and see. Right? It's going to get even more incredible. And so somebody once said that what God does in history is always a preview of the greater thing that's coming. And I think there's a lot of ways to apply that, but I think with these Old Testament characters, it's always a preview of Jesus who ultimately is coming. And notice this, that in verse 44, they ate and had some left. Whatever the Lord promises will be so. He said they would have enough to eat. They have enough to eat, and it's taken care of. All right.
You mentioned your dad.
Yeah.
Death in the pot. I don't know if the poisonous gourds, I mean, I know that was a problem, but what caused the problem was the man's lack of knowledge.
Lack of knowledge. That's right.
Lack of understanding. And of course, that's a problem with what you're,
Yeah.
the lesson there
Mm-hmm.
is people do that out of
Sometimes more actively, they know better and they do it anyway. But a lot of times, it's just out of ignorance.
Yeah. But if you have a question or a doubt about something, not really a doubt, but if something is right or wrong, before you throw it out there, you might want to find out.
Evaluate. That's right.
Well, I have written here, man's ignorance of God, of God's laws, and the conditions of true spirituality is a minister of death.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's poison in the pot.
That's right. That's right. All right. Anything else to verse 44 or anything in chapter 4?
Let me say this.
Yes, sir.
If we don't learn anything else from that, learn how much we need to study.
Mm-hmm.
Study the Bible.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we're going to continue with the story of Elisha, really, but we're going to pick up starting in chapter 5, talking about somebody else. And this is probably, I would guess, among most congregations like us, as far as Old Testament stories, as familiar as they come. But I think it's worth looking at in this context of demonstrating Elisha as this man of God and looking at the kind of work that God is doing among the people. So this is chapter 5 and verse 1. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, or is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his Lord, "Thus and so spoke the little girl from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." What do you notice about Naaman at first?
Just like his status.
Yeah. He's important. He has status. He has a place of prominence.
Valuable.
He's valuable. He's been successful. He's been honored. One thing, I think maybe the thing I find most interesting about that is the phrase, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. You know, I have lots of questions that I would love to be answered, and maybe they will be one day, about what the Lord was doing in and among the other nations other than Israel. But what we see in passages like this is that he was active among those nations. And in fact, in this case, he was active in helping Syria when Israel was the one who was on the receiving end of the punishment. And so actually the Lord is helping Syria against Israel because they're able to take this little captive girl. But Naaman is notable because the Lord has been with him. And I think we'll see something in the attitude of Naaman as we go through that will maybe demonstrate one reason why the Lord takes special note of him along the way. But God is in control in Syria too. And we know that already because remember in 1 Kings chapter 19, there were the prophecies that God was making through Elijah, that there were, actually this is in response to Elijah's questions when he goes to Mount Horeb, and basically God says that there's going to be a new king appointed in Israel, there's going to be a new king appointed in Syria, and it won't be Naaman, but we already knew that God was at work in the place of Syria and other places like that. Now, I will make mention of this. He says he's going to send a letter to the king of Israel. I assume that we're talking about Jehoram by this point. We've already been talking about, and when I say that, I mean northern Jehoram, during Elisha's mostly working in the northern kingdom. In fact, I don't know that we have a single reference of him working in the southern kingdom very much at all. But anyway, I think that shows probably an assumption that the prophet that the little girl referred to would be with the king. Because most of the times in an ancient kingdom, that's where the prophets would be. They would be basically kind of proclaimers for the king. They would just be kind of vocal, voicing out whatever the king's opinion was. Well, that's not the way it works in Israel. The prophet's not with the king. And so you're going to see the king's reaction to that in just a second. I didn't read all of verse 5. So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. If I understand correctly, a talent is, I've read like 20 years labor. And then shekels are months of a month labor, and then 10 changes of clothing, which evidently would be significant. So you're talking about a lot of money here, and something that would be a great gift to the person who can provide the cleansing. Oh, because Naaman was also a leper. Have I mentioned that? I don't know if I said that the whole time. We just know the story so well. I guess I assumed we all knew. But he's a leper, and it looks like a serious case, skin disease that will eat away at your. If you've got a Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary, they've been publishing it for a long time. But I remember as a little kid, I'd go get my dad's Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary and turn to leprosy. And there was a picture of a man, and if you want nightmares, just go look at that, because fingers eating away, nose eating away. It's just a brutal picture. And not all leprosy described in the Old Testament is that. Sometimes it would just be a skin rash or something. But with the urgency and the diligence with which Naaman pursues the cleansing here, it seems to me that there's maybe more to this one than just a rash, that this is something very, very significant. Okay, anything through? Yeah, so two things. One, I would assume that he had become a commander already and then had obtained leprosy somehow. The second thing would be I don't know that everywhere had the same rules about it that Israel had. Him being a Syrian, he doesn't. Syria probably did have some, basically every culture, I think, that has had lepers has recognized, hey, this is contagious, we need to get them out of the community. But he's probably in such a prominent place, he's able to kind of maintain that. But he's not having to follow the same laws as Israel is. They just don't apply there in Syria. So maybe they're making an exception for their rules, but he's not breaking God's rule in that. Okay.
Doesn't matter how important and valuable and mighty you are.
Yeah.
You're going to have some troubles.
That's right. And we often use this story, and I think appropriately so, as a picture of what it takes for a person to be saved. But one thing that a lot of times we have to come to recognize is our need when we, in other ways, are comfortable and successful and honored and all of that, sometimes we get a big old flashing light that says, "Nope, you got a problem." Naaman got that. But what we need to recognize is all of us have had spiritual trouble, even in moments where things might have been going well in earthly terms or in temporal terms. And this is a very helpful story for us to draw some spiritual applications from. And spiritual lessons are supposed to be learned from this. And if we have time, we'll talk about that tonight as Jesus draws spiritual lessons from this in Luke 4.
I don't know if he had leprosy for the reason of humbling him, but it would humble somebody, I'm sure, or it should.
Yes. All right, you want to pick us up through verse 6?
Start at verse 6. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me." I'm going to stop right there for just a second. The king of Syria here, he thinks that he can buy Naaman's healing. Sounds like the king of Israel takes offense to the offer there, because everyone knows that only God could cure leprosy. I assume he knew it, and it was done through a prophet. Perhaps he thought that. He even says it there that the Syrian king would declare war on him for not curing Naaman, or just making up a reason to.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 8 there, "But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, wash and be clean?" So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Oh, me. Okay. Elisha says, "Let him come to me." That call there, "Let him come to me now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Reminds me of Jesus' call in Matthew 11:28. "Come to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." That burden of leprosy and the desire to be rid of it can only be relieved by God through Elisha there. And the burden of sin and the desire to be rid of it can only be relieved by God through Jesus. It seems like Naaman kind of has a moment of pride here. He kind of puts on a show, and he wants a show. But he doesn't get it, does he? What does he get? Do you think he gets a test of faith here? Does he believe that God can heal him enough to follow the instructions? Not at first, I don't think. Why? You think it's because he had his own idea? how it should be done or how he wanted it to be done.
Mhm.
You know, he may have heard of some ceremony and wanted it to be a ceremony. I don't know. You know, he almost,
I have a note I wrote in my Bible that says, people want to compare this to baptism. Baptism, it's not the water that does do, it's just obeying what was told to do.
Mhm.
you know, he almost demands there that it be done differently.
Mhm.
But do people walk away from the church because things are not done the way they want it to be done? It says he walked away. That's a tough lesson there.
Yeah, you think about, first of all, the fact that there's no show provided, but Elisha doesn't even come out. He sends the messenger out. It's like, so here is Naaman in this grand status position that most of the countries around would have thrown everything the king of Israel is terrified of what's going to happen. And Elisha doesn't even go out. He just sends the messenger out. And then he says, go be dipped in the Jordan River. And in reality, if you think about rivers on a normal practical use, the Abana and the Pharpar rivers are way better rivers than the Jordan River. If you look at the Jordan River, it's not an impressive river. The only reason we know about the Jordan River is because of the amazing things that happened in it and around it in the Bible story. It's not an impressive river. But that kind of earthly mentality of I want to show, or I want what makes physical sense, instead of saying I'm going to trust what God has said. I think you're exactly right. I think it is a test of faith. But what I'm impressed with is the level to which God uses people who are not in the significant position of Naaman to get Naaman what he needs. The little girl who was taking a servant from Israel, his servants who go to him and say in verse 13, wait a second, did he say you could go dip in the Jordan River and be made clean? That's what you want. Who cares what the condition is? Who cares if it's a dirty river? Who cares if it's a puny river in comparison to Syrian rivers? You can wash and be clean. If that's on the table, then be willing to kind of throw aside your prioritization or your favoritism for the rivers that we've got here in Syria. But
I have written down here, thank God for people that can explain
That's right.
the way of salvation.
Well, it's just so simple. It's like, well, why argue? If there's cleansing available, let's just take advantage of that and not pitch a fit about it and wish it had been some other way or thought it should have been some. If God says this is what it takes to have cleansing, well, I'll just do that then and be happy with that. He does have to dip 7 times in the Jordan. I think we see that number 7 used several times. We saw it used in the story with the young man that he sneezes 7 times after he wakes up. I don't know what that's all about, but I do think that number 7 comes to have this significance of completeness, restoration, fullness, something like that, wholeness, and then his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean, which is remarkable. Right? To just think about this Syrian. I will say this, I'm just going to mention it. Jesus uses this as an example of, hey, there were lots of lepers in Israel during the time of Naaman, but he didn't heal those. He healed a Syrian leper. Why? Because this Syrian leper was he was reaching out for the man of God when it looks like a whole lot of other people in Israel were not reaching out for the man of God. Now, the end of this, let me just read this next. You have anything else to say through verse 14?
Well, I have that verse that you were just talking about in
Yeah.
Luke 4:27.
Yes.
And why do you suppose he was the only one? But you just mentioned it.
Yeah.
That was my question.
Well, and I don't know. I wouldn't take that to be that there was never another leper that Elisha ever cured, right? I would say it wasn't the rule in Israel. It's kind of like what happens in Nazareth where Jesus is when he's teaching that. It says no one was healed there except a few. Mark 6 is the account where we get that. Well, first of all, except a few. Just a few? That'd be pretty impressive if somebody came and just healed a few, and Phil Campbell or something like that. That'd be pretty amazing. But for Jesus, it wasn't anything to really be noted because in other cities he had gone and healed many, many, many. Well, why? Because those cities flocked to him. Not so in Nazareth. And I think that's what we've got in the story with, in Luke 4, Jesus mentions Elijah with the widow of Zarephath, right? And then mentions Elisha with a relationship to Naaman. And in both those cases, here were opportunities provided to people that were outside of the people of Israel because they had the kind of hearts that God was seeking when people in Israel didn't have it. Now, imagine I came in here and said, you know what? God's taking care of all those other people in other churches, and he doesn't care one bit. You know, he hasn't helped, not care one bit would be the wrong way to say it. He's not done anything for you because you hadn't expressed the faith you need. Ooh, that'd kind of punch you right in the face. Well, that's what Jesus was saying to the Nazarenes, to the people of Nazareth. The people in Israel had not been expressing faith. And he's saying that's what's happening right here today in this room. I'm not doing the work that you want me to do here because you're not demonstrating the faith. You're not reaching out to me for it like people in other places are. And so that was why they tried to throw him off a cliff, because he was saying, you're acting like Israel has always acted, not seeking the true healing power that's available. So I would say, I think that's why Jesus uses this and why he heals Naaman. Not because Naaman was perfect. I don't know that even Naaman had great faith in God at the beginning, but he's a person who has that inclination. I don't mean to get us off track, but it's kind of like in Acts 18 when Paul goes to Corinth. He's afraid of being in Corinth because Corinth's a rough place, and the Lord says, "Don't leave. I have many people in this city." I imagine there were people there who had never really heard the name of Jesus at that point, but they were still God's people in the sense that they were people who would be inclined to hearing the kind of message that Paul came to preach. And I think that's the kind of man Naaman was. And we'll see that in his response here.
Yeah, he's fixing to express it.
Yeah, that's right. So look at verse 15. This is a beautiful prayer, or a beautiful response. He says in verse 15, "Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came before him and said, 'Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So now accept a present from your servant.' But he said, 'As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none.' And he urged him to take it, but he refused." This is Elisha refusing. Then Naaman said, "If not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. In this manner may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship, there leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter." And he said, "Go in peace." All right, so here comes Naaman, and Naaman says, "I know from this experience that there is no God in all the earth except the God of Israel." Now, how much good stuff had Israel experienced? How much good stuff had Israel seen? And even Israelites weren't making that kind of confession. It takes this one personal experience for Naaman for him to say, God's the only God in all the earth. The people in Israel are worshiping Baal at this moment. They're not committed to the one God that's there. And so he really does condemn Israel by his faith. His faith and the ease with which he's pulled into that faith really kind of puts to shame the rest of Israel who had experienced great things from God. And Elisha's refusal of this gift, I don't know all that's involved, but it's showing that God is not being bribed to provide this. It's not like the other gods that you've got to bring these gifts to get God to give them, to give you something. And Elisha's not bought. He's not just going to be a tool of some political thing. But notice he keeps referring to himself. Naaman looking at Elisha, who's barely given him the time of day in some ways, as your servant. Your servant. Naaman is putting himself in the position of being Elisha's servant. Now, Naaman doesn't like Israel's rivers, but he wants some of their dirt. You see that? He says, I didn't want to go to the Jordan River. But no, he doesn't say that. But he wants 2 loads of dirt so that he can literally offer worship on Israel dirt. That's pretty amazing right there. Now, he does have a complication. And I think that this would be a very difficult complication for anybody in his position in an ancient pagan nation. So his master would be worshiping the god Rimmon, right? Rimmon. I guess that's how you say that. Rimmon, whatever. So he would go in with him. And his master, this is his commander of his army, he uses him as his help to get in there. He will lean on his arm and take him in there and allow him to bow down and worship. Now, Naaman says, I know that when I go in, I'm not doing right. And so he's actually praying for forgiveness. Now, it looks to me like Elisha kind of gives him some confidence and say, you can go, I know you're in that position. I would not say I would encourage you to help your boss go worship some false god, just in case you're wondering. But I think there's a recognition of the situation in which Naaman is in and how difficult it was going to be. And so Elisha gives him this kind of clearance, I think, to go on with that, with the recognition that Naaman's not offering the worship, that Naaman is just serving as a walking helper.
Yeah, I read there was some discussion about that. It says, when he says, when I bow myself in the house, you're saying you understand it as he was just bowing as he helped.
Yeah.
As he helped one. I read one that said he was bowing in worship.
To the Lord, even though it was in the house of Ramon. Is that what they were saying?
Yeah, well, no, he says they were saying he was bowing to that idol there.
Yeah.
And so he realizes that's wrong, and he's saying, I'm not going to do that ever again.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it kind of seemed to me that this is kind of looking forward to he's going to have to keep doing this. But I may be wrong about that.
Yeah.
I might have missed
I
that.
understand that. That's
Yeah.
the reason I said there's some kind of a little discussion there about that, and I didn't know.
Yeah, because whatever it is, he has come to the recognition now that God is that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the only God in all the earth, and that whether past or future, the Ramon stuff isn't real, and he does.
Okay,
He's been involved in it.
Give
Yeah,
me a
sorry.
little personal experience.
Yeah.
To that effect there. When I used to work at a cabinet shop, sometimes we built stuff that went in churches, and I knew that they were worldly or whatever you want to call it, and I didn't feel right about it, but it's a job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's kind of what he was doing there, the way I felt about it, like you said.
Yeah.
It was just a job, and
Yeah, that's interesting.
but,
All right. We are about out of time. You have anything else you want to wrap us up with before we're done? Anybody else want to make a final comment before our time is used tonight? Well, thank you very much. And, of course, that's a familiar story, so you might have more to say about it, but just put a pin in all that, and we'll make sure to give you time to say something about it next time right as we get started. So thank you very much, and remind me to do that, too, if I don't remember. So thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.